I'm Dr. Tom Nelson. I'm a fellow at Corpus and a lecturer in the Faculty of Classics here in Cambridge. And this afternoon, I'm going to give a talk about classics beyond the classical. So I've just shared my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Any issues, shout in the Q&A so it's picked up. So yeah, in this talk, I'd like to reflect a bit about the scope and, I guess, limits, as I've said here, of the classical world. Classics, on the face of it, isn't that obvious or self-explanatory a name for this academic discipline. And in itself, the word classics has quite a lot of value judgment embedded within it. This kind of subjective idea, what makes this classical or classics? So I'd like to think a bit about that by looking perhaps beyond some of the more mainstream parts of the subject. So often when we think about classics, what might first come to mind might be two places and cultures in particular, that of Athens, especially 5th century Athens, and also Rome, especially thinking about the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And this is what a lot of us probably think when we first think of classics, and are definitely a core and key central parts of the subject. And a lot of what we do is look at these two different cultures and the various aspects of them: the literature, the philosophy, the linguistics, the art and archaeology, and so on, and the history. So in itself, there are these different kind of cultures and things that we look at. But actually, when we try and define the limits and the scope of classics, we can actually go a long way beyond this. And I'm just going to share a map putting Rome and Athens on it, both based in Europe, but there's a lot of space there, which I'm going to be filling up as we go. So I think there are two ways of expanding how we think about classics. One is spatially, as this map is inviting us to think about, and the other is temporally, thinking about time. So here is a nice long timeline. Rome, the Roman Empire starting about there, 5th century Athens based there. Homer probably sometime in the 7th century-ish, although the precise dates of this earliest Greek author that we know of is all a bit up in the air for various reasons. But again, there's a lot of space in between these kind of starred points, and I'm going to be having a look at a few of them in this talk. So first up, I'm going to look in between 5th century Athens and the rise of Rome and kind of explore what's going on there. And then if we have time, and we'll see if we do, I'm going to look backwards beyond Homer and think about what came before the Greek culture with which we kind of first get evidence of. So starting with the in-between, the world in between, the Hellenistic world. So this is a part of classics that you may well have encountered in some form or may not have. It often falls through the gap between these kind of like lofty peaks of Athens and Rome, but there's lots of really interesting stuff going on. So what we mean by the Hellenistic world is effectively the time after Alexander the Great, Macedonian king, conquered and invaded large parts of the world, well beyond the previous kind of focus on Greece itself, which you can see kind of on the left side of this map. So he went into Asia Minor, into Egypt, Mesopotamia, Assyria, Persia, all the way effectively up to India. So quite a vast kind of space, which is hard to really get our heads around quite what this would have meant at that time, this kind of vast expansion. But Alexander the Great died young and suddenly, and so all his generals carved out their own kingdoms. So the Hellenistic world is effectively a hodgepodge of loads of different kingdoms set up by kind of Greek kings or people pretending to be Greeks, various degrees of Greekness in lots of different places. So you still have Greeks in kind of the heartland of Greece itself, but you also have Pergamon there in Asia Minor in the green, then the Ptolemies in Egypt, who we will come on to. Then the Seleucid kingdom is this kind of vast stretch in the middle through Parthia, Bactria, all the way to India. So this is all part of classics, and it's a huge, wide expanse and has lots of interesting stuff to have a look at. So I'm going to give you a few snapshots of bits and pieces now. But first, the word Hellenistic itself. This effectively comes from an old German scholar, Johann Droysen, who coined this term Hellenismus, which is where we get Hellenistic. And effectively, it kind of means like Greekish. So it's the idea that somehow with this vast expanse of Greek culture into these other places, Egypt, Bactria, and so on, that you kind of got this cultural blending, or this idea that you had this pure Greekness that was somehow like mixed and somehow, rendered less pure by the various forms of contact which it made with other cultures. So perhaps a slightly problematic underlying image, but it's what it's called, so we'll run with it. And in this bit of my talk, I'm going to look at a number of case studies of how this mixing plays out in practice and how you get Greekness facing, absorbing, appropriating and reusing other cultural forms and idioms in various ways. So first up, let's go to the Greeks in Egypt. So the Ptolemies, who you may well have heard of, given that Cleopatra, the final monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was the one who teamed up with Antony and was eventually defeated at the Battle of Actium. But I'm going to look a bit earlier. So Battle of Actium was 31 BC, and the Ptolemaic kingdom was one of the first major powers to arise after Alexander the Great. So we're kind of looking end of the 4th century into the 3rd century. And what's really interesting about this is how the Greek monarchs themselves also simultaneously fashion themselves as pharaohs and use local Egyptian forms to express themselves. So here, for example, are 2 statues of Greek monarchs, Ptolemy and his wife, yet presented in a very Egyptian style: the frontal pose, the Egyptian stone, the lotus flower being held by the woman, the pharaonic crown. These are Greeks, but they don't look very Greek. So this makes sense, presenting themselves to a local audience, perhaps. But there's also more interesting cases where the Greek and the Egyptian are kind of smushed together and kind of combined in interesting ways. So this is another statue base of, 2 statue bases, but the more interesting one's the top one for Arsinoe II, who was one of the first Ptolemaic queens, wife of Ptolemy II. And what's really interesting here is how, although we don't actually have the statue, it seemed like it's got the feet in a similar position to these ones, one forwards, one back. But we've got the linguistic combination of 2 different languages side by side. We have the hieroglyphics on the top and also Greek letters there. So the 2 forms are being combined together and kind of used in interesting ways. So a real kind of blurring of these associations. More recently, also in an underwater dig, we discovered this statue, which is even more interesting, perhaps, in that it's using Egyptian stone again. It's a bit like granite, but it's slightly different, but this black kind of stone. But here the pose is very Greek. We've got this kind of see-through-esque clothing, but also the clothing has an Isis knot associated with the Ptolemaic queens and has an Egyptian background. So here too, there's kind of mixing going on. And similarly, in this decree on the right, we've got Egyptian text below it. So very much kind of basically an Egyptian kind of stone with writing. But the image on the top is very interesting in that the horse rider is presented in a very Greek pose. So here too, we've got the kind of the Greek and the Egyptian being set by side and combined in interesting ways. So this is a far cry from like 5th century Athens. We've got a lot of interesting cultural mixing and appropriation going on. I'm going to move on to something slightly different now, which is the mixing of the tales from the Jewish Bible with Greek myth. So moving effectively to Jerusalem, which has a long history itself in terms of the classical world, and especially the Hellenistic period, because it was right in the middle of all these competing Hellenistic kingdoms. But I'm going to focus on a bit of literature this time. We have fragments of several different texts, poems from the Hellenistic period, which effectively retell stories from the Bible, from the Jewish Bible, in Greek literary form. So we have bits of a tragedy, kind of being a kind of Euripides-style take on different bits of Genesis. But here I'm going to focus on and show you one fragment which treats the so-called binding of Isaac, when Abraham is told to sacrifice his son to prove his kind of faith and allegiance to God. So I'm going to show it to you. The Greek is on top, but we don't need to look at that. But I think it's always useful to just kind of have the real thing there as well. So I'll read through the translation. I have often heard in the ancestral doctrines how once, O renowned Abraham, preeminently radiant through the knot of Isaac's bonds, your God-beloved charms abounded in wondrous counsels. For to you, when you had abandoned the splendid bulwark of your celebrated progeny, i.e. Isaac, the praiseworthy thunderer, preventing the sacrifice, made his divine pronouncement. From that time, the offspring of your praised child received much hymned renown. So first up, this definitely kind of presupposes the story. It's not a straightforward telling of it. But what's really interesting is that these lines of Greek are in hexameter form, the form associated with epic and especially with Homer. So this biblical story is being kind of set on alongside and on a par with that of the Greek mythical epic tradition, especially that of the Trojan War. An interesting thing there is that the Trojan War itself started with a father being told to sacrifice a child, i.e. Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek expedition, who because he had angered the goddess Artemis, had to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, before sailing to Troy. So although there's no hint of that directly in this fragment, we can kind of see how these different cultures and traditions had different stories that could be set alongside each other fairly easily. It could also be interesting to think about how this compares with the actual account in the Bible itself, because here we have the praiseworthy thunderer, which seems to be a reference to God, the God himself, coming down and giving instruction, whereas in the Bible it's only an angel which is a messenger on behalf of God, which is very fitting given that the etymology, the Greek word angelos, from which angel comes, means messenger. So that's a kind of nice background link. But so here it's not on a kind of, in terms of statues and sculptures like I was saying in Egypt, but still we've got this mixing going on. And there's a few other interesting things we can say about the poem. I flagged loads of words here in red, which are all words that only appear in this fragment. They appear nowhere else in Greek. So it's a very original kind of creative composition in its own right. But we can also set it against both the Bible and Homer more directly. I already mentioned the contrast in who was giving the pronouncement, but specific words such as praiseworthy are also ones that are used in the Bible of God. So there's kind of drawing on the language of the Greek Septuagint, the translation of the Bible into Greek. So there's this kind of two cultures blurring clearly here. What's perhaps more interesting is the word that means thunderer, which is what is called a Homeric hapax legomenon, which means a word that only comes up once in the whole of Homer. So there are quite a lot of words that fall into this category, and especially in the Hellenistic period, amongst loads of different poets from different places, there was a keen interest in kind of both working out what these words meant, because if they only appeared once in Homer, often they were already obscure in antiquity itself, but also in reusing them in their own poetry to kind of show off their learning and knowledge and cleverness, and often kind of link back as the direct node to the passage in Homer where this word appeared in its single attestation. And that definitely seems to be the case here too. So the passage where this appears in Homer is from Iliad 13, the middle of the Iliad, the book of the Trojan War. And I won't read it all through, but effectively Ares, one of the Greek gods, one of his sons, Ascalaphus, has been killed. And picking up from just before the red, but as yet thundering mighty Ares had heard nothing of his son's fall in the mighty combat, but he sat on the topmost peak of Olympus beneath the golden clouds, restrained by the will of Zeus, where were also the other immortal gods kept away from the war. So assuming people were reading or hearing this poem and aware of Homer, which is likely given how central Homer was to the education system throughout antiquity, I think there's interesting links that we can make here, in that Ares is also losing a son, but here or actually losing a son, because Isaac is replaced and not actually sacrificed in the end. But he is unwitting and unaware, unlike Abraham, who is very much in the know. But it's also worth noting that here the adjective is being used to describe the God of the Jewish Bible, which raises a number of interesting questions. So is Ares like that God? And that could be quite problematic, kind of associating with the violent, aggressive God of war. What should we make of that? So this kind of mixing of different languages, cultures, forms often raises lots of interesting questions. But now I'm going to move on again more to the architectural side of things and jump far further east to a place called Ikanum, which is north of modern day Africa. So now we're at the far right of this map with which I began. And this was a site discovered a number of decades ago, which has a really wide and interesting range of architectural finds, which similarly show this kind of blurring of local forms with Greek styles. So I'm going to go through a few of them now. First up, there was a theatre, which is very unusual. You wouldn't normally get that in a normal city out here. So there's a clear kind of Greekness or assertion of Greek identity going on. And that's even clearer in these few remains at the bottom right of this slide of statues that are naked, which is completely anathema to Persian, Parthian, Iranian self-presentation. So in all the local idioms of this place, nudity was completely unacceptable and horrific, whereas it was very common in Greek architectural and sculptural presentations. So here we've got this kind of assertion of Greekness in a pretty much not very Greek space. And perhaps even more interesting than that is an inscription from this place, which is a dedication by someone called Klearchos. And here on the front, you can see there's a number of kind of bits of inscribed Greek, which are all in fact Delphic maxims. Klearchos is probably a pupil of Aristotle, so probably someone who came from kind of mainland Greece and somehow voyaged all the way out here to the far eastern stretches of the Hellenistic world. But not only did he travel all that way, but he also brought with him some of these maxims, these kind of generalized summations of kind of like proverbs, all the way from Delphi back again in main Greece. So I flagged Delphi there on the map. So Klearchos decided that it was important to bring these maxims all the way to this place and inscribe them on this statue base. We don't know what was on the actual top of it. We just have the block at the bottom. But it's very interesting that as part of this assertion of Greek identity in this very kind of different space, he's kind of collected these sayings from one of the core religious sites and hubs of the main Greek world and brought them here. There are also various other things we can note. The fountain spouts in the form of masks, like of Greek comedy. Drama was a key aspect of Greekness. We already saw the theatre a moment ago. So this comic mask is in itself a very kind of Greek thing. And also this what's called a herm base, which is these statues which effectively have the upper body and then just kind of a base below them, which is inscribed saying Tribolos and Straton, sons of Straton, very original naming practices, set this up to Hermes and Heracles. So this came from the gymnasium in Ikanum, which in itself is another very Greek custom and institution. It's where you go and train as a young man. It's like the gym effectively in the modern day. And that they often had these herms in gyms linked with both Hermes and Heracles, the two gods of the gymnasium. Heracles for the kind of physical side of it, getting big and brawny, but Hermes also for the kind of intellectual side of it. Part of the gymnasium was also training and kind of more education, not just kind of who can lift the heaviest weights. What's interesting about these names here, Tribolos must come from Macedonia, is kind of ethnically shouts Macedonia. So here too, we have people who've come a long way, all the way from the far left of the map with which we started to the far right. So various kind of Greek things on display, aspects of Greek identity, Greek culture, Greek custom. And yet, when we look at the space at a wider perspective, it looks very un-Greek. So this is an artist's reconstruction of what the space effectively would have been. But there are lots of things here which don't feel very Greek at all and shout far more kind of Mesopotamian, Iranian style. We've got the flat roofs, which is very non-Greek, mud brick buildings, very few columns as well. There's just a few at the front and not that many even further back, despite columns, say, if we looked at something in Athens being all the rage everywhere. So the space would have felt very different and kind of had this more like local Iranian feel to it. And this is especially true in the major temple that seems to have been found, the so-called sanctuary and temple with indented niches. And this is very Eastern in character on the outside. Here again, we've got an artist's reconstruction. It's a square temple, which is very un-Greek. Normally we would expect a rectangle. Again, it's mud brick, no columns at all, just these indented niches, which is again, yeah, very, very unlike anything you'd get in mainland Greece. And it's far more typical of like Iranian and Persian architecture. And it also seems to have been associated with a kind of typical fertility goddess, again, something more associated with Eastern cultures than those of Greece itself. And yet, in the middle of this temple, we find something rather different. There were these sculptural finds which look and feel far more Greek. The clothing, as well as this huge foot, which is probably part of a cult statue, perhaps Zeus. And this might be kind of hints of a thunderbolt. So Zeus, a very typical Greek god and deity in this slightly different environment. So lots of mixing going on, this blurring of Greek and Iranian. And we can see this too in various other finds. There's this gilded plate of Cybele, the mother goddess, this slightly more exotic goddess. We've got various Persian things. The chariot is very Persian, as are the lions leading it. The parasol is very Iranian. And yet there are hints of Greekness. This figure seems to be the goddess Nike, the goddess of victory, a very Greek figure. And the clothing is also rather Greek. So here too, we've got mixing on a small scale. Something else we find, there's a treasury where there was a clay jar with these various names, Oxe Boakos, Oxe Boadzos, and Oxe Boakes, which again are all names which very much shout local derivation, all probably linked to the Oxus River. And yet we also, in this same treasury, found kind of the imprint in reverse of a papyrus, which has since long faded away, but the ink has kind of been set into the stone, so we still have it, and it's a bit of Aristotle. So again, like the Delphic maxims, we have kind of old school, if we want to call it that, kind of aspects of Greekness here. And it's not only kind of mixing of Greekness and Iranian Persian culture, because there are also various glimpses of Indian influence. So here is an Indian narrative plate depicting Indian myth, probably the result of trade beyond Ikanum into India. And similarly, we have coins of Greco-Bactrian kings, so kings nearby, showing Indian deities, so really broadening out. The final thing I want to flag on this is something from nearby, but slightly further south, from Kandahar in modern-day Afghanistan, and turning to poetry again. And there was a big inscription found here quite a while ago now, which I put the Greek there. We don't need to read it, but it's very interesting in terms of what it says about the identity of whoever set it up. So yeah, as I say, it's from modern-day Kandahar in Afghanistan, and I don't have time to read it all, but it's dedicated by someone called Sophitos, the son of Naratos, which are both not Greek names. So this may well be an Indian or someone else, but unlikely to be a native Greek, and yet they're writing in Greek about what they have done. Effectively, they're talking about their rise from poverty to great wealth and riches through trade. But what's interesting about the inscription is that it has an acrostic along the whole side of it. So every first line first word of each line builds together to say something. And it says, by Sophatos, son of Naratos. So he's really banging home that he is the author and the key person to bear in mind, but also a kind of show of learning and skill and sophistication in being able to do that with the text. So here it is. You can see it down the side, and it's really set apart to really make it clear. No one can miss the acrostic. But perhaps what's more interesting is how this person also echoes Homer again. So I flagged a bit here in colors, but he effectively says when he went as a merchant, he went to many cities, which is the opening of the Odyssey, effectively, where we hear that Odysseus, one of the great heroes who sailed back from Troy and went on many a very long voyage to get home, he too saw many cities, we hear. So within the language of this probably Indian person writing in Greek is echoing one of the most archetypal texts of the Greek tradition itself. And there's probably two things we can say about this. First, he's showing off his learning. He knows his Homer, which almost in itself is a mark of Greekness. He is proving his Greek credentials. He belongs to the Greek world, even if he doesn't come from it, but he's kind of grown into it through his trade, through his education. And yet also it's interesting that he's aligning himself with Odysseus. So he's kind of asserting his own like almost heroic stature and skill and ability. So that was the last point of this that I want to bring up. And on this map is just a summary of the various stop-offs we've had on this tour of the Hellenistic world. So we can see geographically and culturally what we mean by the classical world is often a far lot broader and bigger than we would think. I don't really have time to go on to the second half, which I would have if I had time, but that can be for another day. But there I was going to think about the Epic of Gilgamesh from Babylon and the various links people have seen between that and Homer. So that would have been thinking not so much spatially, but temporally, and thinking about perhaps the background to the Greek epic tradition that we see suddenly sprout into life with Homer, but which must have much more of a background, not only in Greek tradition, but probably in other cultures as well. So ultimately, when we're thinking about classics, although Rome and Athens are key parts of it, it's actually a far messier, broader, bigger kind of picture. And in many ways, I think that's a far better reflection of our own interconnected modern day as well. So I think for many people, that's what makes it such a fascinating subject to explore. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. And are we going to do it? Actually, firstly, is my interference still problematic?
It seems better.
Oh, that's good. So shall we take some questions now?
I am very happy with some questions, yeah.
Let's have a look. The earlier, and it seems to still be the case, there are so many questions now in the chat that it's actually almost impossible to scroll through properly. So I thought there were some coming through a minute ago, actually, that were there seems to be one so far that's come in that I can see. Wait 1 second, it's gone now. How would the Greeks have reacted religiously to Christianity? Would they still have been polytheistic, or were they incorporating other different parts of the Christian faith into their own?
Great question. So yeah, this is kind of moving a little after the Hellenistic world, but I think the Hellenistic world and what I was talking about is a useful kind of springboard for it, because we can see how permeable boundaries were in various cultures and ways, and in many respects that carried on with the rise of Christianity. And in fact, well, it's a huge topic, but lots of bishops and others with the rise of Christianity were kind of simultaneously invested in and heirs of the kind of Greek pagan and Roman traditions, as well as the kind of growing Christian one. So they often write kind of alluding to Homer and others like these Hellenistic poets, and And so, yeah, very much the same kind of multiple sources of debt and connection and background. And then you've got the kind of rise of East and West Christianity and all that kind of thing. So it's very, very complicated, but that is also, part of the subject. It goes into late antiquity and beyond in terms of the reception of traditional classics. So hopefully that answers your question, but yeah, definitely a good one.
Cool. And is there any notable influences on ancient Greek culture that many people assume is naturally Greek?
Oh, good question. Well, yeah, so this is going to the bit which I didn't have time to touch on so much. But there are clearly lots of connections between kind of Greek culture and even language and those of other cultures, especially those which were around earlier. So thinking more those kind of in Mesopotamia, Babylon, but also like Cyprus was very important as a mode of connection between these kind of more Eastern cultures and the Greek mainland, and lots of the islands kind of in Asia Minor were key kind of intermediaries between them. People also kind of reconstruct what they call Proto-Indo-European. I don't know if Joe talked about this earlier, which is basically this idea that lots of the Indian and European languages all have this kind of common root, and the language etymologies can often be traced back to this kind of proto-language from which they all derived. So both kind of in terms of direct inheritance and also sideways cultural influence, definitely a lot is going on. But it's largely things coming from the older East, if we just sum it up like that, the main influences on Greek.
Someone's asked if architecture is a large part of classics.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends what you define as architecture specifically. Definitely archaeology and art is probably how people would sum up that strand of classics that is looking at the kinds of things I was looking at. And architecture is part of that, looking at buildings, their construction, their materials, and various bits and pieces. So that's definitely what the kind of the art archaeological strand of classics definitely has that aspect to it. And there are lots of really interesting buildings. Another one from the Hellenistic period, which could be worth a Google, is the so-called Pergamon Great Altar, which is currently, like many things, is no longer where it was originally in Asia Minor and Pergamon, but is now in a museum in Berlin. And it's a huge kind of frieze that goes around multiple sides of a gigantomachy, and it's very cool. So lots of interesting buildings and other bits and pieces that we look at as part of the ancient world, definitely.
There's a question about sort of asking for general reading recommendations for this topic.
That is a good question, and to some degree it's all quite disparate. There are kind of general introductions to the history of the Hellenistic world. If you probably search online, there's a kind of introductory book by Graham Shipley. Wikipedia also has some good inroads, just generally with some background. If you're still looking more, feel free to send me an email, and I will suggest more specific things.
There's a question about, how do you think that translations have impacted our understandings of literature like the Bible?
Definitely. Translation is a really important thing for understanding. And as we see with the various different kinds of translations of the Bible through the ages, can have a huge impact on interpretation. Closer to kind of the traditional classics as well, thinking about the Odyssey and Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey published a few years ago, which was like the first kind of modern translation of the Odyssey by a woman. And it's very interesting how she was just picking out kind of assumptions or kind of misrepresentations or various bits and pieces that various male translators through the ages hadn't quite thought about. So definitely both the identity and perspectives of a translator can have a huge impact on the outcome, their final translation, and also any translation radically can affect any reader's interpretation of the text as well.
And There's a question about when you get to sort of work alongside other departments, so Oriental Studies, for instance, when you're sort of researching these, like the Greek influence on other parts of the world.
What was the question specifically?
Sorry, yeah, it was. So do you ever work alongside other departments, such as the Oriental Studies department, when researching the Greek influence in other parts of the world?
Yes, so specific researchers definitely do that, and I guess this is the kind of thing where it would be perhaps more an undergraduate dissertation where you could really hone in on a specific detail and explore it more. And there's definitely a chance for interdisciplinary connection. As part of the undergrad course, also, especially in the final year, you can borrow lots of papers from other subjects, and quite a few you can like learn Akkadian from from the Mesopotamian studies. And so, yeah, there's lots of chances to kind of to cross-fertilize interdisciplinary work beyond the various facets of classics into connected subjects as well, definitely.
What is the misconception about classics that frustrates you the most? And P.S., could you somehow share the Gilgamesh info with us to read it at another time?
Good question about frustration. What was the noun? The most frustrating?
Sorry, it's gone. It's suddenly.
No worries. That's fine. That's a tough question, and I have to say I don't know if any of you kind of encountered it anywhere online currently, but lots of scholars are reflecting actively on what classics means and the scope of the discipline, given that it has been around a long time and has lots of associations, especially in Britain, with kind of the kind of origins of Western civilization and all that kind of thing, which, as many people are now showing, is quite a lazy and dangerous stereotype, given all the cultural mixing that I was just kind of hinting at. This idea of a pure kind of Western civilization from which our modern kind of Western culture, if we want to call it, is derived, is in many ways reductive, and kind of all the cultural mixing of the modern day has always been around. And so I think, this kind of neat idea of Greece and Rome, with which I started as what classics is probably it. Is what I'd answer to that one. And in terms of the Gilgamesh stuff, it's difficult. There's no real nice approach. Well, there is a book I think called by someone called Lopez Ruiz, Caroline, I think her name is, which is kind of like a kind of handbook, guidebook to various connections between Greek stuff and Near recent ones. The trouble is, like, the major academic work on it was by someone called Martin West, who is no longer with us. But effectively, he just wrote pages and pages, kind of highlighting possible connections, and just said they speak for themselves. And as anyone talking about anything, any kind of academic work would tell you, you always need an argument. And he kind of just threw it all out there and was like, look at all this stuff, and kind of didn't make the argument, which is a really important part of any academic work. So people are still trying to make the argument and work out what to make of it all, often in quite kind of heavy detail. But I suspect, again, a Google would show up some things. Looking on Google Books, another good resource to look at is Google Scholar, where you can search a work, an academic publication, and then it will show who it has been cited by. So it's often a useful way to kind of look at recent scholarship, perhaps in articles that are available online for free, or for books that you can have a look at a bit of, at least, on Google Books. So there's ways to trace threads yourself as well, which is a good thing, good practice for the kind of university study where you have that slightly more freedom to explore things as well.
Someone's just asked if you have any published academic works that discuss this topic in wider context.
So some of my works are focused on Pergamon, that place where I mentioned with that great gigantomachy big altar, where I look at a few kind of inscribed poems from there. And often in the Hellenistic period, everyone focuses on Alexandria, the Ptolemaic kingdom, because most of the literature comes from there, and it often is treated as shorthand for the literature of everywhere. So I kind of try and say, hey, what's going on in the literary culture of this different place? If you go on my website, which you should be able to get to if you find me on the Corpus kind of fellows list, and then there should be a link to my website there. And then you go on publications, you should be able to find it. It's called Athlid Aesthetics, and it's open access, which means anyone can kind of see the whole download the whole article without any kind of login or anything. So that has a bit of stuff on the Athlids, which might be of interest, kind of as a more kind of closer study of a specific place.
Okay. Sorry, a few coming in now. Oh, sorry, it's just it keeps changing.
Blood, isn't it?
Yeah.
There was a question at some point about will they teach classics at beginner level, i.e.
Oh,
no
yeah.
background knowledge. I don't know if what has come up in earlier talks today, but effectively, yeah, classics, you can come having not studied it at all, with very limited knowledge of the cultures and the languages, with no knowledge of the languages at all. And you can either, if you have Latin A level, there's a 3-year course, whereas if you haven't done either language before, being Latin and Greek as the main ones, as the main part of the course, or you haven't done them to A level, there's a different kind of there's a different version of the course which starts with Latin from scratch and builds things up. So yeah, you don't need any prior knowledge, and that's one of the great things about it. You can come in if you just find this stuff really interesting, like I do. You can start, be taught by some great people, and really kind of experience it and learn it as you go, even if you've not had the opportunity in any form before.
Okay. Do you see any other questions that you think it's good to answer now?
I'm just having a look. There was a question ages ago about how many places given for the 4-year course. I don't know if that has been answered. And there's no fixed number for that. And in many respects, the faculty is very keen to overall boost the 4-year component of the course. So there's no set limit, and often over the past few years, the number of 4-year candidates, 4-year places taken up and offered are increasing. So yeah, no fixed number, but definitely worth going for.
Okay. Opportunities to study abroad?
Yes. Off the top of my head, I don't know precisely how it works. There are definitely lots of opportunities to go and do, especially in the summer. Say like there are different courses, especially those run by the British School at Athens and the British School at Rome, which are kind of 2-3 week courses going around some key parts of Greece and kind of Rome, and they're definitely worth it. There are lots of travel grants for exploring other kind of classically connected places. In terms of more sustained study, the faculty has a number of links with perhaps Munich, somewhere in Germany. I'm not sure if that's more at graduate level, but there are opportunities to do things, and if you're very keen on it, there's definitely things can definitely happen.
Okay. Somebody has asked whether or not this. Oh, sorry, it's gone here. Is the art and archaeology classics module similar to art history at A level?
Good question. I'm afraid I'm not up to date precisely on how art history works at A level, but I guess it's probably similar in some degrees. Like anything, like any aspect of any study, you are analyzing, interpreting evidence and data to produce some kind of argument to say something interesting. And what that evidence and data is differs whether we're looking at texts or images or kind of historical facts. But all kind of academic study is similar in that general kind of framework. So it's probably similar in some respects, but I am afraid I don't know precisely how art history at A-level works currently to be able to answer that more specifically. There's a question about how did Rome's contact with the Hellenistic period affect their development of civilization, which is a great question. And yeah, the development of Rome was very much indebted to that of the Hellenistic world in various forms, politically, socially, culturally. If we think about like emperor cult, the development of the idea of like worshipping Roman emperors as quite like almost gods, that seems to very much build on a tradition of that in the Hellenistic world, where the Hellenistic kings of the different kingdoms were presented as like divine figures, especially after death, kind of worshipped posthumously. But also in specific different spheres, especially in say literature, if you actually pick up say a bit of Propertius, the Roman love elegist, he mentions loads of Hellenistic poets all the time, especially someone like Climacus, who was a Ptolemaic poet from Alexandria, and the kind of aesthetics and concerns of these Hellenistic poets are massively picked up by Roman poets who were kind of very much aware of this Greek background. Ovid makes a quip about conquered Greece conquering Rome, i.e., although Rome conquered the Greek worlds militarily and kind of subsumed them within the Roman Empire, actually culturally Greece kind of got its own back by kind of forcing its own cultural background and heritage into Rome. And lots of prominent Romans went and studied in Greece, especially in Athens for philosophy and other things. So there was constant cultural interplay into the Roman world as well.
Cool. And a few final questions in the chat. I think they keep on moving. Are you finding this as well? Yeah. So were the cults like that of the? I'm not going to try and pronounce that because I'll just fail. Yeah.
Eleusinian mysteries. Yeah. Yeah. So the Eleusinian mysteries were associated with Attica, just outside Athens, and yeah, with this kind of like mystery cult with various kinds of initiatory practices. That was fairly in itself kind of based specifically in that place in Eleusis outside Athens. But similar cults, kind of mystery cults, were very prominent and common in lots of different places. And actually, one of the main things in the Hellenistic world was this kind of importation of effectively exotic foreign gods and their cult practices into Old Greece, if we want to call it that. So things like Isis, the Egyptian god, and various other kind of gods of more personal salvation, like the goddess Fortuna in Latin, fortune. This kind of worshipping fate and chance itself became a far more common thing. So this more idea of personal religion that we kind of find in the Eleusinian mysteries was definitely a growing thing. Yeah.
There's a question that I think has come up a few times actually. I don't think we've answered it. Is do you get to study sexuality and gender identity in the ancient world at Cambridge?
Yes, there's not currently one specific module on it, but it definitely comes up in lots of what one would study. Like any literary text, often a key thing to ask about it is kind of presentation of gender and identity in various forms. There's currently I think part 2 option for art and archaeology, which is kind of about art beyond classical art, a bit like this title, the title of this talk, but very much looks at the presentation of different kinds of forms and different times, especially non-classical forms, especially again in the Hellenistic period, where you get different non-traditional kind of shapes or like presentations of people with different associations. So that's definitely something that is a key part of the subject in various ways, and again is something that would definitely work nicely in the final year as an undergrad dissertation topic as well to look into more.
There's a question about whether you feel there's a class divide or in terms of classics and access-based issues in funding?
Well, at undergrad level, effectively, in terms of funding, as far as I'm aware, there's a kind of the government loans, and which is kind of applicable to everyone. In terms of access to classics, I think yes, it is a real shame that it's not more available in more schools across the country, and that's one key reason why there's the 4-year course to allow people who've kind of developed a passion for classics independently, perhaps, or kind of as a side track of what they've been able to study at school, or if they've done classical civilization but not had a chance to study the languages, or any other kind of combination of different things. That's why there is there's that way to study it without having done it before. So I think everyone engaged in classics wants as many people as possible to enjoy the subject, which everyone who is engaged with it loves.
Okay. What's the difference between classics and classical civilizations?
Yeah, classics and classical civilization. Well, I guess so. Yeah, a class civ is also the name of kind of a subject that you can study at school, isn't it? Which is, I guess, more focused perhaps on specific things. Perhaps in particular, Athens and Rome, with which I started. I think classics itself is just broader and encompasses a wider range of the different ways of approaching antiquity, which I listed before, of like literature, languages, linguistics, art, archaeology, history, philosophy, and through a kind of broader time scale in which different people can focus on different times and interests as they prefer. So it's the breadth of it, perhaps.
Someone's asked if you have to study or learn Latin on this course.
In terms of the 4-year course, yes, Latin currently is compulsory. It's a very useful thing to do, to be able to kind of engage with some texts in the original. And as I was saying before, translations always have their own kind of ideological framework to it. So you do have to learn Latin, but it is challenging, but very rewarding and worthwhile.
And should we just do one more question, I guess? Is there an opportunity to study Greek theatre on the course?
Definitely. So both in terms of drama, like the plays of Euripides, Aristophanes, Aeschylus, Sophocles. Pretty much every year you can study some drama as part of one of the literary options, and then the theatres themselves are kind of archaeologically come into the art and archaeological side of things. So definitely theatre is up there as an important strand as well. Yeah.
Cool. Right. Shall we leave it at that then?
Yeah, I'm sorry if we haven't got to your question. There are so many there, but hopefully people enjoyed that and found that useful.
Thank you so much for answering all those. I think students will find that really, really useful. Right, so I think we are basically at the end of the day. I mean, Tom, do you have any sort of concluding remarks or?
Not really. I kind of summed it up. If you're interested in other things, my website has a few links to bits and pieces that might be of interest if you want to check things out. The Corpus Classics webpage, if you kind of go to subjects and then classics, at the bottom of that we have some general kind of, Joe and I have put together a few general bits of kind of links to resources or kind of suggested reading. So that could be somewhere to look to if you wanted to follow up anything further as well. But otherwise, I hope you found today useful, informative, and enjoyable.